Hey guys, I decided to do my research on is the acute and chronic workload ratio an effective tool to monitor injury risk and can it be used for prevention? So I basically first became interested in the prevention side of athletic training freshman year when Brian asked the class what the main role of an athletic trainer was, and everybody gave different answers, but we were all wrong because he said it was prevention. And I remember thinking back as to like why we don't do more of it if it's supposed to be the main role, and I guess it's always kind of stuck in the back of my head. So the acute and chronic workload ratio is basically just a ratio that measures your workload and or your duration times the intensity. Basically, it's measured through the most recent 7 days of training to the last 28 days of training. So 1 week to 4 weeks, and it is measured through your external workload versus your internal workload. But most commonly, it is usually the external workload will be duration, and the internal will be intensity. But there's several ways to use external workload. So it can be time, so how long, speed, so how fast, distance, so how far you went, number of reps. So you can even go down to like number of reps, number of throws or hits as a measurement. And then the internal workload can be measured through blood lactate levels, heart rate, and most commonly the rate of perceived exertion, which is just a scale. So the rate of perceived exertion is an internal workload measurement, and it's a subjective scale that you use after each training session, whether it being a practice or a game, to determine how hard you worked based off your own perception. It is a 1 to 10 scale, and basically 1 would be described as like at rest, so just kind of sitting there. That would be like kind of where you're at before practice, where you're just kind of sitting on the side. And then as you go down the scale, it's more intense. So 10 should be like your max effort, like your 1 rep max, out of breath, inability to talk. There's also a Borg scale, but the Borg scale is a 6 to 20 range, and it's not used as commonly in research or studies. The acute and chronic workload ratio and injury prevention. So basically, the ratio sweet spot, as they would like to say, is at 0.8 to 1.3 range. So in that range is where you're least likely to have an injury. But when you go below that 0.8, your body is at a higher risk of injury because it is not at its max effort, and it's not at the ability and level to play in like game settings. So you're not working as hard as you should to be prepared for those instances. While in the 1.5 and above, you're at a greater risk of injury because you're working out of like your range. The higher the acute number, the higher likelihood you have of injury versus a higher chronic number on the ratio side would show a higher resistance to injury. The research I did find on the acute and chronic workload ratio only highlighted certain areas and certain sports. For example, the measurement is usually the duration times the intensity, and the measurement would usually be just all injuries. There were a couple of studies, which was just 2, and those were based off of mechanism of injury. So they did non-contact injuries as a count versus all injuries. And in the research, I found that, again, they only looked at certain sports, and they only had research on male subjects. So I think it'd be interesting to look into as to why they only do that. So my problem statement had a lot of points, but a couple of the main ones were the acute and chronic workload ratio has only been researched on certain genders and sports. For example, most common sports it looks at are cricket, rugby, and professional soccer. And the ratio is also only kind of researched in the professional sport level, as well as only on males, as I had kind of mentioned earlier. And then again, only a couple studies did look at its connection to non-contact injuries. So my independent and dependent variables are, my independent is the acute and chronic workload ratio, and my dependent is number of non-contact injuries. The reason it's on the dependent side is because it's dependent on the ratio as to what is kind of occurring. Although the rate of perceived exertion and the acute and chronic workload ratio can be paired together alone, some researchers have suggested that you should pair the rate of perceived exertion with heart rate, since it is a subjective scale. And what that kind of means is we could both do the same workout, but to me it would be a 7 on the RPE scale, and for you it could be an 8. And so that's why it kind of varies. And the acute and chronic workload ratio can be individualized, or you can use it for the whole team to kind of base, like, duration is everybody has the same duration. However, everybody may not have the same intensity. So my inclusion criteria basically is pretty straightforward. They must be soccer participants who participate in soccer, official soccer practices and games. To be included into the injury count, they must be a non-contact lower extremity injury, and then only injuries that are sustained during the official practice times and games would be counted in the study. So if they were in the weight room or doing intramural sports, those wouldn't count because they weren't we didn't see it, we don't know. The exclusion criteria would be contact injuries, so that just means if they ran into another individual, that's a contact injury. And then any injuries sustained to the upper body or the head will also be excluded. Injuries sustained outside of practice and game, which is another exclusion. So my outcome measures are obviously the acute and chronic workload ratio would be calculated every Sunday, kind of just to keep up with the information and to see how each team is doing as the season progresses. And then the rate of perceived exertion will be taken after each game and each practice session for each individual to kind of see where they're falling per session. And then number of non-contact injuries that occur throughout the season would be tallied as they occur. And so basically that would mean anytime anybody from soccer would come in for an injury, we would look at basically mechanism of injury, and if they're in either a male or female that plays soccer at TOU. So my evaluation protocol is basically determine if the injury fits my inclusion criteria, determine if it's within official practice or game times, and then determine the date and calculate the acute and chronic workload ratio for the time of injury, and then also tally the time of injury as it occurred. And then these are my references.